We're gonna go ahead. We're gonna continue our series this morning, our Advent series, looking at being Christian, and particularly Rowan Williams' look at being Christian through the lens of baptism, the Bible. Today's focus on Eucharist, and next week we'll be wrapping up with prayer and kind of how each of those different pieces, kind of help to shape us and guide us in our efforts to be Christian, to live a faithful Christian life. So since we're talking about Eucharist today, I wanted to at least begin us with one of our collects, with one of our collects for Eucharist. And so this is from Easter 3. This is the road to Emmaus, is the gospel lesson we have that week. And then this is the gospel lesson, or this is the collect that goes along with that, which has us praying, "O God, whose blessed Son made himself known to his disciples in the breaking of bread, open the eyes of our faith, that we may behold him in all his redeeming work, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen." So just as I said, wanted to kind of get us started as we're talking about and thinking about Holy Eucharist and what it means, thinking about one of the primary lessons that we use in our scriptures to talk about it throughout the church year. But as Williams kind of begins walking us through his discussions, through his writings about Eucharist, he kind of begins by talking about it just a few different pieces that end up being particularly important when we're talking about Holy Eucharist. Those different pieces are the idea of invitation and hospitality, the idea of fellowship, and the simple idea of just simply eating and drinking. While we know that that's what is involved in the Eucharist, there's a particular piece of that eating and drinking, which we'll get to in just a moment. But it does also, while we think about Holy Eucharist, it is important to remember that the basic elements, that bread and wine, food and drink, those are the sort of essential, the physical, the tangible kind of elements, or if we want to get into catechism language, they're the outward and visible signs of what is happening within Holy Eucharist at that moment. But even beyond that, it is so much also about what is happening, not just sort of what those basic physical pieces are, but it's about what is going on within those moments. And in particular, looking back to Jesus and how he began to establish this. Rowan talks about he didn't establish Holy Communion in a single moment. It wasn't established only at the Last Supper there with his disciples. This was something that Jesus was working towards and crafting and shaping all throughout his ministry, both pre and post-resurrection. And so if we begin to think about the idea of invitation and hospitality, he begins to talk about this from a very interesting story, from a very interesting gospel lesson. And that's the story of Zacchaeus, which isn't really what you would normally think of when you start thinking about Holy Communion. But as Williams is talking about the idea of invitation and hospitality, he begins to look at Zacchaeus, because for Williams, the idea of the hospitality being offered in this moment, it's not just about Jesus inviting us. It's not just about us being brought in to share that meal with him. It's also about the hospitality that the meal draws out of us. And so we'll talk about Zacchaeus in a couple of minutes, but it's the idea that when Jesus looks up into that tree and he sees Zacchaeus there, Jesus' response is to say, "Won't you invite me to your place? Won't you offer that hospitality to me?" And that's going to be an important piece of the hospitality, the hospitality that we talk about in a few minutes. But the idea that not only are we the invited guests, and that we are given the free, but then we are also, after us being invited, we are given the freedom and really the instruction to invite others to share along with us. Jesus welcomes us to the table, and we end up welcoming Jesus into our own very selves. And so to kind of talk a little bit more about the idea of the invitation and hospitality, as I said, it's about, he begins talking about Zacchaeus. And even the idea is that even if it's not Jesus' own home, if it's not just there, you know, we have the idea Jesus is supposed to be the host of Holy Eucharist. He's the host, but that's not all that is happening. That's not the only piece that's going on. But even as Jesus is the one there, it's also Zacchaeus needing to invite Jesus into his home. Zacchaeus needing to invite the townspeople into his home, and then the generosity that this whole experience begins to show. You remember, Zacchaeus then responds to that moment by saying he's going to pay back those that he has received the funds from. He's going to pay back all of those around him. And so Jesus does issue an invitation in Zacchaeus' story, but he's actually inviting himself into Zacchaeus' house. Won't you ask me into your home? And so Williams writes, as he continues on, he writes, for Christians to share in the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, it means to live as people who know that they are always guests, that they have been welcomed and that they are wanted. It is perhaps the most simple thing that we can say about Holy Communion, and yet it is still supremely worth saying. In Holy Communion, Jesus Christ tells us that he wants our company. Jesus desires for us to be with him. He desires for us to go and to be a part of things. We are invited into the Eucharist, but in the meal, Christ is also saying to you and to me, won't you invite me into your home? Won't you invite me into your very self? Invite me into your heart, is what Jesus seems to be saying here. And so we end up, and the idea, you know, as I had said, it's the hospitality that's offered for us to be brought to the table, but then that is the piece, that's the hospitality, the won't you bring me into your heart. That's the hospitality that Jesus is drawing out of us. And once we begin to draw Jesus into our own heart, we begin to draw others into that same place. We begin to draw others to share in that same moment. That other sort of, you know, one of those other sort of essential pieces is the idea of fellowship. And again, this is something that Jesus is working on, that Jesus is crafting all throughout his ministry. There are, you know, as we look through the scriptures, there's at least 12 different moments where Jesus is sharing a meal, is talked about eating with the disciples, or sharing a meal in somebody's house, or eating with the tax collectors and eating with Pharisees, breaking bread and offering a feeding to 5,000 and to 4,000. There's 12 different times that Jesus eats in the gospel. And it does also include that Last Supper. But what he's doing in these moments is he's sharing food, he's eating together and doing those basic things. It helps to build fellowship, it helps to build friendship as you share in those moments. Where Jesus would go, there was often incredible numbers of crowd. You know, the crowds were always there. We think about the 12 disciples. You know, we think about that kind of main group of Jesus followers. But what we often forget to sort of remember is the idea that there were disciples beyond those 12. Those were the primary disciples, the ones that were with Jesus the whole time, the ones that he primarily worked and interacted with. But there were people who would follow him all throughout a particular town. There would be people who might follow from one town to the next, and maybe they wouldn't keep going, but they would still follow him for short distance or short times. And then they would still be able to go back. They would still be able to talk about him, what they saw, what they heard, what they experienced there in the presence of Jesus. Another piece that, and even within this, one of the parts for us to remember is that the disciples, whether the 12 or beyond, these were people that came from all kinds of backgrounds. These were tax collectors, they were gluttons, they were fishermen, they were sick, they were unclean. Jesus didn't really care who he spent his time with. He didn't really focus on what somebody had been. He focused on how it was that they were that they were responding to him and to his sort of, Williams uses the term, the indiscriminate generosity that Jesus offers. And you can think about that, think about the healing of the 10 lepers, the indiscriminate generosity. 10 are healed, 1 returns. The indiscriminate generosity of 2 loaves and 5 fish and thousands are fed. The indiscriminate generosity of a woman just simply reaching out to touch him and being healed. Jesus isn't worried about who these, necessarily who these people are, where they come from, what they've been doing. He's focused on what it is that they need, and what it is and how it is he can respond, how it is that he can offer something. He doesn't turn anybody away that wants to follow him. Although certainly there are times that people end up turning themselves away from him. We can think of that, the young rich man who, came to Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And, and in the end, Jesus says, go and sell all your possessions. And all we hear is that the young man went away. We don't know what happens next, but it seems almost as if he himself is turning himself away from Christ in that moment. That other and kind of the third sort of piece that ends up, that we're looking at is that simple act. And we bring it to this kind of simple piece of it here, the eating and the drinking. And the disciples, if we think into the book of Acts, and as the disciples turned into, turning into apostles, as in the very early stages, as they're trying to sort of, give themselves and talk about their own credibility and why it is that people should listen to them about Jesus, their claim is, we are the ones who ate and drank with him. It wasn't at that point, it wasn't that they had been given special power. It wasn't that they had been given special privilege. It was that we are the ones who ate and drank with him. We are the ones who shared in those meals, who sat by his side, enjoyed his company, and learned from him in those moments. There is within this that sort of physical act of eating and drinking. There's the physical act of passing plates and dishes and the nourishment that comes from the food. This is all important as well, because it engages the senses. You can smell the food, you can hear the conversation, and people saying, "Oh, this tastes so good," and that sort of thing. You talk with each other about what it is that you're tasting, and you hear people talking. And if it's a meal among friends, you hear the laughter, you hear the joy, and you come to know each other a little bit more intimately. But even beyond this, there is, and you can never deny, that there is also a deep spiritual act that happens within communion. There's a deep spiritual thing that happens with Holy Eucharist as we take Jesus into our bodies. The phrase, you are what you eat. And so we consume and we bring Jesus into ourselves, and he becomes a part of who and what we are. And that happens physically, but it does also begin to happen spiritually. And you receive and you take in, and you receive and you take in, and you become over time more and more like Christ, as you become more and more in tune, as you become more and more in tune in who you are taking in to yourself. And so all of these pieces, these, the fellowship, the eating and the eating and drinking, the hospitality, these all come together and help to provide us with some of that meaning, with some of that depth of understanding of what is happening. And communion, the Holy Eucharist, in so many ways, it's more the experience of what is going on than it is the sort of conscious understanding. It's what are you experiencing and what is happening within you in those moments. It's one of those pieces where, when I work with families and they ask me, well, should my little one come and take communion because they don't know what's going on? And my question to them, is often something along the lines of, well, what do you think happens in communion? And usually, the parents will have some sort of explanation, some sort of discussion. But then the next question ends up being, does Susie want to receive communion? Yeah, she does. She's asking me. That's why I'm here. Well, if she wants to be a part of something, then she knows in her own language, at her own ability of something that is happening. She wants to be a part of that fellowship. She wants to have some of that food and drink and that nourishment that is happening. And she is feeling and desiring an invitation to come and to be a part of it. And so at however much she might be able to understand at whatever age she might be, if she has a basic desire to receive, then she is understanding and is desiring to be a part in her own way at that moment. So all of this comes together. All of this becomes a piece of how we are experiencing what is happening in Eucharist. But as a big part of this, William then continues. He kind of sets the stage with these, but he then continues and he says that so much of what happens in communion, so much of our understanding has to also then be seen through the lens of the resurrection. Without the resurrection, our idea of what is happening within that meal that we share on Sunday mornings, that there is something significant missing from that moment. And so we've talked about how the entirety of Jesus' ministry is what lends its significance, is what helps to shape and craft what is happening in the Holy Eucharist. It's not just that moment on Maundy Thursday where he's sitting at the table. It's the entirety of his ministry. But importantly, if Christ is to be present in the Eucharist, he must be risen. If we're going to talk about Jesus being really and fully present within the bread and within the wine, that cannot happen if he remains dead. The only way that he can be present is if he has risen already. And so the work begun by Jesus prior to the resurrection ends up being the work that is continued after Christ is risen. All of that time he spent walking and spending time with his disciples. All of that time he spent teaching them. All of that time he spent eating with them. Everything he did before the resurrection, he does again after. Which shows that all of this is helping to shape and to become a piece of this. Remember those early appearances. He tells Mary to go back and to tell the other disciples that I've risen. And then as he begins to appear to the full group of the disciples, that first time he appears in the upper room afterwards, give me something to eat. When he appears on the road to Emmaus, let us, he builds that fire. They share the fish and the bread there on the road to Emmaus. He is dining and he is eating and he is joining again in fellowship, doing those same things that he had been doing before. But even beyond those physical acts, and we talk sometimes, he has to do this. He has to say, give me something to eat, as a way to sort of prove and to show that he's not simply a ghost, because ghosts don't eat. Only those who are alive need to eat. We talk about that in some ways, but this is also a continuation for him to be welcomed in. Zacchaeus, won't you bring me to your home tonight? Give me something to eat. Do this for me. Offer something to me. Invite me to be a part of this moment in a way that will add depth and significance and meaning. And without the resurrection, the meal that we have on Sundays simply becomes a memorial. This is a paraphrase of Williams at this point. Without the resurrection, the meal we share on Sundays becomes simply a memorial of a sad meal in a sad upper room. With the resurrection, it becomes a moment of intense gratitude for the grace and the blessings bestowed through the resurrection. We are reminded of what is accomplished through the resurrection as we share together in that meal around the table on Sunday mornings. Because it is in our baptism, to kind of take it back a little bit to Rob and what he was sharing with us. In baptism, we are brought into fellowship with the apostles. This is where Williams gets a little dense, as Williams is wont to do. But in baptism, we are brought into fellowship with the apostles. And since we are then in fellowship with the apostles, we now can claim with them that we too share a meal with Jesus, that we are both invited to, and which we invite Jesus to be a part of as well. So we take our place at the table of the meal that was begun and which has never ended. The meal that was once shared and the meal that continues to be shared, we are now a part of that same moment, that same meal, as we are brought into fellowship with the apostles. And so all of this, everything that is happening, everything that is going on with all of these pieces, there is within the meal, there is within us, and there is in the world a transformation that is taking place. We can think back to all of those moments where the Holy Spirit was present in Jesus' life. We're here in Advent. We talk about Mary being told that the Spirit will conceive in her womb a child, and that child will grow to become Jesus. When Jesus goes to the river and he's there with John, it's the Holy Spirit which comes down at his baptism and which changes and transforms what Jesus had been doing into his new vocation. As the Holy Spirit is there and brings life into the dead body of Jesus. And it then continues even after the resurrection and after the ascension, when the apostles then receive the same Spirit at Pentecost. So each of these moments is a drastic transformation. Where there was thought to be no life possible with Mary, new life begins. Where Jesus had been doing whatever he was doing at that point, he is then transformed at baptism into the vocation that he then carries on. Where his body had once been dead, it now lives again. And where the disciples had once followed Jesus, they now lead the charge in his honor. And so we expect, and so there are all of these transformations taking place, and we expect also within the Eucharist a transformation to take place upon the sort of basic pieces, those physical elements that are there. We expect a transformation to take place within the bread and within the wine. And we expect, I think, a transformation to take place within ourselves as well. We expect the Spirit to help to transform bread into body and wine into blood. We expect the Spirit to transform these basic elements, wheat and grapes, into hosting the very real presence of Jesus within them. But we also are transformed by the Spirit to both receive the fullness of the gift being bestowed upon us, and also to be empowered and then sent out into the world so that we would be bearers of the Christ that we now bear in ourselves. And ultimately, we would continue the cycle of the Christ inside of us, inviting others to come and to eat and to drink. And so it's not just something that happens with, just like Jesus, it wasn't something that happened only there in the upper room. The communion, the Eucharist that we share becomes something that happens not just on Sunday mornings at the altar, but it becomes something that happens all throughout the week. We continue to bear Christ wherever we go, and we continue to, in different ways, to offer that Christ and to invite others to come to know Christ in the world as well. And so the transformation that begins to take place in the world, it's the idea that that if the meal that we share, and we talk about it being a foretaste of that heavenly banquet, we talk about it kind of giving us a glimpse of the world to come. And so if that is happening, then Holy Communion becomes a view, it becomes just a beginning, perhaps, of the end of this world. Each celebration of the Eucharist, he writes, brings us closer and closer to the close of this world and to the full and perfect realization of God's ultimate purpose. And so each time we celebrate communion, we are coming closer and closer to the full realization of what God's kingdom can be and one day will be. We come closer and closer to how the world is being transformed and used to accomplish all that God has laid out for its purpose. We can see and we can experience a transformation of the basic elements. We can see and experience a transformation even of ourselves. But then what this does is it provides that glimpse of how all things will be transformed from their own simple elements into a more full purpose and to a more full means of grace. And so it's that it is that reminder, it is that idea, as we began talking about at the beginning, that Eucharist is not a single moment. It's not a snapshot of time. It is something that is continually happening. It's continually happening within the church. It's something that is continually happening within ourselves. And it's something that is continually moving forward. So that is sort of a quick kind of glimpse and a quick sort of piece about what it is that, kind of how Williams begins to talk about how he begins to sort of share what's going on within the Eucharist. I really tried to kind of break things down a little bit. I heard Nancy chuckling earlier when I said that Williams can sometimes get a little dense. If you've had the opportunity to read some, then you know what I'm saying there. He can say things in 3 words that it takes me, 4.5 pages to write. But he really does pack a lot. But it is for him. It's the idea of something of a meal that is never ending, that has been shaped and crafted from before the meal to and after the meal. It is something that Jesus was doing, that he was shaping and putting meaning in the entirety of his ministry. And it's something that for us continues and goes on and kind of continues to live and continues to transform ourselves and the world around us each time that we share in it, each time that we take that Eucharist into ourselves, and each time that we then go out into the world. So just to kind of give us an opportunity and to give me a little bit of a break maybe from talking and you a little break from listening to me, I pulled out a couple of the questions that Williams kind of asks as he's reflecting towards the end of his piece, and kind of having here within it, the idea or kind of the question. And so I am asking you, so I'm going to expect some raised hands and some responses back here. In what ways do you see yourself as a guest at the Lord's table? And then as part of that, what do you then share in common with the other guests? And so I offer that to you, and would love to hear some of your responses. I guess, do you see yourself as a guest at the table? Okay, I'm seeing some heads nodding there. We got it. There's a.
I'll always
Yeah.
I actually really love this idea of Jesus welcoming us to his table. That's not how I thought about it. So my immediate response is, oh, okay, I'm a guest. And I love the fact that he's invited me to his table. That's really welcoming me.
Yeah.
And when he said that, I thought, it's so lovely when someone says, you are my that, to be invited anywhere is such a wonderful thing, right?
Yeah.
So Eucharist is really important to me, but I haven't, as taking Jesus into myself, I got that piece. But the part about being a guest is actually a Christian.
Yeah. Tim?
I checked the service bulletin. We had the sentence in there, but at the very beginning of the service bulletin. But I remember when Fred Reynolds was here, this was said almost every Sunday before communion, where the priest welcomed anyone to the table, no matter where they were on their journey. And that felt like more of an invitation than anything that I've seen since.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think has fallen by the way. I know that we have it in the bulletin, but to hear it said as part of the service becomes very meaningful.
And in some ways, more of an invitation than
Yes.
what is called in the Eucharistic prayer, the invitation,
Yeah.
which is simply the gifts of God for the people
Right.
of God. And then you can extend it, beyond that. But the gifts of God for the people of God, that is intended to sort of impart the idea that you are being invited, that you are part of God's people. You're desired to be a part of that and to come forward and to receive.
Yeah.
Not nearly as direct as it.
Yeah, and I realize it's called the invitation. It's part of the service, but we don't live in the liturgy in the Eucharistic prayer 7 days a week, and to bring what we experience as part of out in the world into the service, I think becomes especially meaningful, at least for me.
Yeah. Nancy?
This makes me think of actually Susie's story, which I will share, of going to church in New York City. I can't remember which one it was. St. Bart's, but everyone being invited up around the table. So when Eucharist starts, you move, everybody, or as many people as can, move up to the front. And that really feels like I'm being invited, I guess. And so we're talking that was the picture that I had in my mind of that invitation being so explicit.
Yeah. And we do something on a small scale, similarly during the summer on Thursday evenings, where we invite people to come up around and gather around the altar and Paul's cross. And so people come up and are closer up there, or at least were up to the last couple summers. But but there is that opportunity to come forward. I remember one of the sort of more powerful examples that I've experienced of that sort of invitation, that welcome within the Eucharist. I was in England and I went to see Coventry Cathedral one day, and it was in the middle of the week. And as I was there, the sign, all it said was it just said Lutheran Eucharist. I'm like, well, I go to Seminary of the Southwest, we have Lutherans. I'll join the Lutheran service. And I sat down and I, said hi and greeted a couple of people as we were getting started. And from the opening word of the celebrant, I knew I was in trouble because it was all in German.
Oh.
And I don't speak a lick of German. I mean, Burkardt is a very German name, but I don't speak a word of it. But I was in there, and what I began to realize as we were going through, I could tell where we were in the service. I knew what was happening because I was familiar with the kind of rhythm and the flow and the way that people were responding. But then as we got to the piece, I sort of said something to somebody like, no, you should stay, stay here and come and be a part of this with us. Which, and so that was a really sort of powerful piece, that even when I wasn't a part of that small community or part of that language, I was still encouraged and asked to stay and to remain a part of it. But even beyond just the existence of that service is an incredible testament to hospitality, because that German language Lutheran service had been going on since World War II. And Coventry Cathedral is one of the is famous for the way that it was completely gutted out by the bombing. And so that for that service to continue, for that German Lutheran community to continue to have a home in that space, in that building, is an incredible testament to hospitality and invitation as well, I think. Kitty, and then we'll keep moving.
I often think of that when I go up into communion of how it's going to affect me. And I think of it as a reminder every week of certain things. But I think I should be focusing also on the sharing piece. I think the fact that we're all sharing this at the same time together in this place is something that I think puts a different light on the whole experience.
Yeah, it is. It is something that cannot happen on its own. I can't celebrate Eucharist without anyone there. There's no way for the service to continue without responses. There's no way for me to share anything if others aren't there with me. And
Say one more thing.
yeah,
Yeah, I think, when you run a live stream in the back, the one really interesting, well, there's several interesting things that have nothing to do with technology. It has to do with how we process up to receive communion. And you sort of watch as people, now with COVID are trying to keep their distance and, kind of negotiate all that stuff. But when people stand up to go to the front, something happens. You can see their body language change. And just sort of seeing everyone in that procession and being part of that procession is very meaningful. And sometimes when you're seated, you just don't notice that. You get up when the usher comes by and you go do your thing, but you don't see the community piece of it.
right.
As easily.
Yeah. One of the greatest things I ever heard was Nancy Life once talked about that journey from your pew to the altar as a pilgrimage, and making that pilgrimage each and every week. A pilgrimage is a journey you take to bring yourself closer to God. And so she was talking about, just that walk from the pew to the altar as a weekly pilgrimage to take. Tim?
Yeah, I was just going to share that becomes even more noticeable if you're serving up front as either an acolyte or even as a lap, because I've always been impressed, especially at the big services as an acolyte, watching people coming up all the way up, people who are having a hard time negotiating to walk down the aisle and to walk up the steps, who are bound to determine that they're going to have chair at the high altar. And that's something that's very special.
Yeah. That's one of the hardest transitions that I hear people talk about in bigger churches like this is when they can no longer go forward to receive, and what they miss from, because they have talked about not feeling as much a part of what is happening when they find meaning in it being brought to them, but they also miss being a part of the going forward as well with the church. So then the we've kind of actually started to touch on it a little bit as well, but talking about seeing others and seeing the community as a part of it. But for you, does receiving communion, does receiving the Eucharist help you begin to see the broader world in any sort of a different way? Does it help you engage and look at the rest of the world, Susie?
Well, what I was thinking was, I really missed lemming. That to me is more of, that to me is what communion is about. And I
Mhm.
really miss that a lot.
Yeah,
It's not just receiving it, it's giving it.
it's the sharing.
Yeah,
It
it's
is.
the
It's the
sharing.
invitation, and it's
Right.
the hospitality that
Right.
is. Yeah. You have been invited to be a part of receiving it, and you are then, and that's sort of your response to the Christ that
Right,
is
is to
your
give it.
response to go out
Right.
is your response to Christ's invitation within it. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, people are talking about, lemming, but for especially the late Christmas Eve service, I play the kind of stewardess, go this way, go that way, and just sort of stand there. People are coming to church who only go to that one service a year and they don't know what to do. And it seems like a real show of hospitality to be there to say, oh, just tell the priest that you need the gluten-free wafer and, just fill in over there and that kind of thing. But you see how meaningful that is, even though people don't go to church every Sunday, something has brought them that night to participate in this, and it's meaningful. And then you get these people that only come once a year and they want to kneel there forever. And you really want to go over and kick them and say, don't you see there?
Or you get the dirty look when you say, go over to the side chapel, because they want to go up the aisle.
That's right. But there's something so mysterious about communion that I don't think I totally understand, but I see it.
Mhm.
I see it. And as Susie said, you see it in the face. Like every person that you serve does it differently. And the idea of being a lamb, you think, oh, I'm just taking this cup and I'm going, no, everybody wants it differently. And you see how individual it is, yet how community building it is.
Mhm. Mhm. I'm always struck, part of me would love to do some kind, get those old like Google glasses that you could take pictures like with your glasses and stuff. But the part that always strikes me is the hands, and the difference in the hands that are coming forward. Some are, not just the sizes, but you can see the wear and the work on on the different hands, and some are just all kinds of bent and crooked and all kinds. And some, some are teeny and tiny, and they're just, cherubim soft, from the little kid. But just the difference in the hands and the way that and how that shows just how many, as we were talking about, how many backgrounds people are coming forward from, to come around this one table. The entirety of the world, kind of being brought forward, and I see it in the hands. Is one of the ways that I see it, but it's that entirety of the world being brought and invited to come and to participate in that meal.
So I just want to contribute because I agree with Susie that the experience of running is just so powerful, and the way it relates to me as a performer in theater is that I always feel like when that's happening, the energy that comes between you while you that it's like you really are a vessel for the Spirit. It flows through you, and it's just I also feel that when I read, and so that absolutely transforming when I just
That's such a great way to talk and to think about it. Kind of and feeling that flowing, into, through, and out from you and into those.
and then that
It's a wonderful, grace-filled, feedback loop. Yeah.
When are we going to be able to lem again?
Oh, yeah. That is a great question. Great in all kinds of meaning of that word. So, but again, so thank you for, for our conversation here at the end and kind of the sharing that we've offered here. Just a reminder that next week we're going to be talking about prayer from the good doctor will be coming forward for us, offering us a conversation on prayer next week. So thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.
Thanks.